So welcome everybody. I'd like to get started by thanking you for joining us. I'm Fiona and I'm the CEO of the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative, ASI, and joining me is the ever thoughtful Estelle, who is the co-founder of Levin Sources, which is a social enterprise consultancy that's B Corp certified and women-led. Estelle, hello to you.
Hi, Fiona. Thanks so much for having me today.
Pleasure. So I'm actually based down in Australia. Estelle's in the UK, and our audience tonight is likewise spanning many countries. Our theme is going to be impact, cooperation, and remedy. And we're focusing in particular on minerals and metals and the role that voluntary standards can play within this space. The format we'll use is largely a conversation over the 45 minutes that we have together. And we've mapped out some key topics that we'd like to try and cover, but definitely welcome your questions as we go along. So with that, we might get started. First of all, Estelle, welcome again. We've been talking for a long time, 15 years, I think, about supply chain due diligence, particularly in the metals space. How mature do you think are these due diligence approaches today? And what do you think are some of the barriers to making them more effective?
So I've known you for 15, but I've been working in this space for 20 years, and I'm quite excited. Yeah, same as you, exactly. And I have to say, I'm quite excited about where we're going. It feels like things are really evolving in the right direction, although recent political changes globally may create some headwinds, I think, for that progress. We'll see what happens, particularly if the EC does move forward with the consolidation of minerals or supply chain relevant regulations, as they're beginning to discuss. But it's clear that when we first began really working on supply chains, actually the conversation was around fair trade. You know, that was where the innovation was in metals value chains, and I was involved in the feasibility study to see if fair trade gold, fair mined gold, could be even possible and desirable as a product category. And that was way back in 2005, 2006. But then
also the time when Responsible Jewellery Council got started as
actually,
well. But yes, around that time,
you're
gold, I
absolutely
think,
right.
was active. Yes.
Gold was active, yeah, absolutely. Kind of on the back of the wave of the blood coltan issues in DRC, which then brought attention to conflict gold and created this momentum.
And jewelry.
And exactly, and jewelry being very tied to that, and of course the blood diamond issue as well. So jewelry kind of took the lead. But what happened with the OECD minerals guidance, which was the very first due diligence guidance for supply chains from the OECD, was it's a market entry standard, and so it's supposed to only really apply. I mean, everyone has to do the first two steps, but you don't really move into step 2B on deeper due diligence unless you identify red flag risks.
Right.
And that means that it really is confined to enabling businesses to source from conflict affected and high risk areas where otherwise they may be motivated to disengage. And ultimately its purpose is to help bring stability through peace and stability through economic opportunity. And so it had a very particular sustainable development intent as a way of keeping these deteriorated, fragile societies involved in responsible value chains, so they wouldn't be pushed into having to work with more criminal networks or networks that didn't care about responsible business conduct. And what has ended up happening over the years is that standard has become the norm for all minerals in all jurisdictions. And frankly, it's actually just not enough to really drive sustainable development through minerals and ensure that businesses are operating responsibly in accordance with the broader set of international conventions we have for ESG. And that's why we now are pushing and seeing new regulations and standards moving to take the lead more from things like the United Nations Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, which is broader and has extra expectations, and also the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. So there is that shift in the regulatory environment, whether it's mandatory or voluntary systems, that is kind of pushing companies to move towards, let's say, standards that will drive greater change and not just keep marginal producers involved.
And I think that's an interesting one, the OECD due diligence guidance. Obviously, ASI has incorporated that and really had to develop a new set of guidance, for the aluminium sector in particular, because the original supplements were focused on those that were the initial targets of conflict minerals for that region, for DRC, so tin, tungsten, tantalum, gold. And you have very different market dynamics, you have very different operational risks, that are associated with the different commodity supply chain. But common across those has been that voluntary standards are actually playing an implementation role often. They're being a bridge between these sorts of intergovernmental framework or legislative frameworks to kind of map out what does that mean in a particular sector, and how can businesses grasp what can seem new or thematically different kinds of processes, map that into a kind of a language that the sector helps to understand. So how have you seen voluntary standards play a role in that space?
Yeah, I think they're massively beneficial because they, if you're a member of a voluntary standard initiative, in some ways the voluntary standard initiative does some of the thinking for you, because it will automatically be compelled to seek to ensure it's aligning to the regulations that exist, but also those that are being charted out and are on the horizon. And so by being part of a voluntary standard initiative and maintaining assurance against it, you can have comfort typically that you will be compliant with the major mandatory regulations that exist. But I think voluntary standard initiatives do more than just supporting companies to comply and to feel ahead of the curve. They also allow companies, to learn. They're a tool through which companies build capacity. I remember our time at the RJC together when I was on the standards committee, and you were the head of standards, the director of standards. RJC had initiatives to support peer-to-peer learning, so that those that were more experienced with implementation of the standard could act as a mentor through to companies that were new. I know the RMI, for example, has just created a role for a kind of a customer service, a member services person that can help new members be directed to the right process, the right standards for them, help them understand what they should and shouldn't be doing. So they no longer need to go to third parties and pay for that advice in order to make it more practical and feasible for them. But I think perhaps one of the biggest things that voluntary standards initiative can do, if they choose to, is because they are building a coalition of members allied around a common set of performance targets for ESG issues, they can also build collective action on specific issues that may be of greatest materiality to that community of members. And so they can build value chain initiatives, for example, that support the downstream to engage upstream members and jointly address some of the most salient issues that are impacting organizations along. And that's where I get most excited, because I think that's where we can really start to see change, because individual companies rarely have the leverage they need to really address root causes and reduce the salience of risk in a way that's meaningful for all stakeholders. Often they can find their efforts to just reducing the risk for themselves, because that's all they can practically do if they are acting alone. And I think there's a role and an increasing role for voluntary standards institute to play that role as mediator, convener, coordinator of joint action on the ground.
And I think the building of relationships with stakeholders that are acting in the regions, even if it's a convener, if you like, of the conversations that need to happen going forward.
Yes.
So I think we've had a question in advance about how do voluntary standards help companies fulfill those supply chain obligations. I think it's a range of things. It's kind of tailoring guidance. It's supporting kind of training modules. We've certainly done that within ASI, workshops and similar. And, providing those kinds of relationships that includes with rights holders, on the ground through things like ASI's Indigenous Peoples Advisory Forum or IPAF, that's an important role as well. But ultimately, I mean, I think the OECD guidance memorably frames its work as that it's an ongoing, proactive, reactive process. It never really finishes. There's new intelligence, there's new relationships, there's new risks that are dynamic that needs to sort of go along. So sometimes I'm sure it must feel for companies that the work is never done, but I think that is part of the process and part of any kind of risk management approach that takes account of those risks.
Can I add something, Fiona, on this? I think it's really
Please do.
important that companies
Yes.
that are considering becoming a member of schemes like ASI and others understand that, you know, the OECD guidance is both the minerals guidance, but also their guidance for responsible business conduct, which is increasingly the one that that standards and companies are seeking to use for minerals value chains in combination with the minerals guidance. But they both say that it's, you know, you cannot outsource due diligence. The responsibility for doing due diligence continues to sit with the business actor itself, that is within the value chain. And it's the role of standard setters and also third parties like Levin Sources as an advisory firm to support that company to fulfill those responsibilities, to respect human rights and to manage other risks as well. So ASI can be a facilitator, for example, but it cannot take on the responsibility for a member. And I just want to make that really clear for members that may not, or for organizations that may not be accustomed to working with a standard setter like you.
Yes, thank you. Appreciate that. And that's a clarification that we've made on a number of occasions. And I think it's particularly important in the context of growing regulation, which makes sure that you know, the company retains the accountability for those things. And it's I think, challenging because it is a new space, some of these legislative developments that are happening. And I think, you know, for activities or looking far up or down supply chains is new, you know, past perhaps the tiers of engagement through B2B relationships that have been had to date. Are there ways that you're seeing companies get rewarded, you know, for that effort? Or does it still sort of feel like sticky effort, you know, at this point? And sometimes perhaps the head above the parapet, you know, not always rewarded for transparency or for effort that's undertaken.
Do you know, I have to think for a second here because I'm actually distracted by a conversation I had yesterday with a mining company that is TSM certified, AAA status, and it's investors. It has a new project. It's a new extension to its project, an infrastructure piece to the mine.
Okay.
And the investors have appointed a due diligence actor that is using the equator principles. And they are looking for things that are not at all proportionate with the level of risk. It doesn't make any sense to me, actually, given my OECD and UNGP's lenses. And unfortunately, in spite of that company's AAA status, the investors aren't willing to rely upon that as any form of assurance for the quality of their risk controls or their processes. And so there are certainly, I think that's an example where there are pockets, and perhaps more so in the investor community, that are still not fully aware or understanding how they can best make use of these standards as you know, as forms of assurance around, you know, around their own business interests in a potential investee. But certainly in supply chains, what is clear is that companies that are doing due diligence well understand that there are so many benefits in terms of supply chain resilience and ultimately controlling the costs of incidents should they arise, because good supply chain due diligence helps you really know who you're material to and who's material to you in terms of the business partnerships, and therefore helps you allocate resources for building relationships where it most matters from the point of view of controlling mutual risk. And in so doing, and that's not just in case of who do you depend on for the majority of the product you're buying, but which are the suppliers that are most likely to cause you a headache and are most likely to have incidents arising. And so you're going to really focus on those two kind of categories of suppliers to really work closely together. And when you do, if you do it in a partnership-based approach rather than a policing-based approach, which is something unfortunately many businesses haven't quite evolved to do, you get to the essence of good business, which is trust, and you're more likely to get early warning of issues arising. You're more likely to be involved in helping, build solutions for issues as they're arising, and you already have the foundation there for if something really bad happens and being able to deal with it well, because the human relationship side of things are there. And I think that's something that if due diligence is led by compliance teams or procurement teams that are just trying to push the price down, you get tensions. It's more adversarial than, you know, whereas there's an art to due diligence.
Tensions of objectives. Yeah.
Exactly. There's an
Yes.
art to due diligence, which is actually ultimately about people. It's about relationship building, and it's about laying the groundwork for going, the proverbials hit the fan, what are we going to do together? And not just it's hit the fan, you're a very naughty boy, I'm going to just, I'm not going to do business with you anymore, which is kind of where it began. Way back when we began doing supply chain due diligence. And so the OECD is really strongly calling for this, for a much more partnership-based approach. I actually spoke to a stakeholder in Asia who told me that European buyers are coming with like a checklist and saying, if you can't do this, it's table stakes, we won't even work with you. But the companies in their jurisdiction, many of them are quite small, are quite new to this. They've not yet got all their ducks in a row, but they're wanting to learn. They have got a bit of support, but there's a big gap between where they need to be and where they
Right.
are. And in order to be able to get that business, they're perhaps not being completely honest. But equally, therefore, they're not going to go to that buyer when things happen, and because they fear that they will lose that business relationship. So that very paternalistic approach actually undermines our ability to control risk.
Yes. And to mature approaches, to
Yes,
feel that you can start and then mature that over time. Yes,
yes,
that's something
exactly.
we certainly try to talk about in our standards. If we turn now to think about impact, which is what we're trying to achieve through
Yeah.
these sorts of processes, through maturing due diligence, through understanding risks, looking at ways to mitigate them. To what extent do you think traceability is a driver of impact? Is it something that moves us in that direction, or does it, in some circumstances, become a bit of a distraction? Should we be focusing on the atoms as they move through the supply chain, or the actors, the relationships, the business relationships, and the trust and so on that you've been talking about so far? Very interested in your thoughts on that, Estelle.
Yeah, I remember back in 2014 at an OECD meeting in DRC, and I had just begun a project for the government of DRC with Rupert Cook, who we greatly miss, who passed away a couple of years ago, to help the government of Congo consider which aspects of due diligence should be allowed to be a monopoly within their jurisdiction versus, competitive. And traceability was what everybody was talking about at the time. Should they just have one government mandated system for traceability, or should it be diversified? In the end, they did produce a government system for chain of custody for gold. But diverse systems are ultimately able to then build on top of that. At the time, I remember thinking, can we stop talking about traceability? There's much more to due diligence than that. Traceability is the means. It's not the ends. It's just the means. And I find that we still are in a world where there's so much panic about we have to get full traceability to get full transparency. And if we don't have that, we can't act. And that's just not true. It's practically impossible to get full visibility on every value chain. And you just have to go as far as you can and work with what you've got and continuously improve. And so we need to remember that traceability is the means and not the end. And as such, I think if you're having to spend too much on trying to get traceability, there's not a lot of resources left to actually act on the information you get through traceability, because traceability is just a form of really about information generation. So you track the physical product through the chain of custody of who holds it, and so who owns it, but who also handles it at each stage, and you also therefore track the geographies through which it moves, and that combination gives you a view on the risk associated with that product as it's been stewarded along the value chain towards wherever you then end up being in the value chain. And then on the basis of that, as it gets moved, records of data are somehow loaded into some kind of record keeping system. And there's multiple ways that companies do that. They may use a blockchain, they may not use a blockchain. And that allows you to get traceability, because then you can look at the history of the product. That's how it works. And I used to think that traceability was a bit frustrating because everybody was so obsessed with it, but I'm increasingly seeing that there is a very important side to traceability, which is supporting extended producer responsibility, or universal producer responsibility ultimately. And we really need that to grow recycling rates and to improve the circularity of metals as they move into second life and so on. And that becomes a key driver for building sustainability in metals systems. And so we need traceability to not just support us looking back up the value chain, but to support accountability for, or responsibility for, stewarding those metals as they move to the consumer, through the consumer, into waste and into second life as well. So I think there is obviously enormous value to traceability. It's like the skeleton, it's the backbone. I call it a hygiene factor in a way. You have to do it, but don't obsess about how far you've got. Go as far as you can and keep working to bring visibility to the blind spots that you think really matter. Don't throw all your monies into it. You know, make sure you've got resources left aside to actually take action. And we can talk about that. There's much more to say about that, Fiona. I know we both want to talk about that. But also think about traceability, not just as a way for you to get visibility on what's upstream, but for the upstream to get visibility on where their product goes. And that's something that actually from an equity point of view is really important. You know, you will meet, I think you've mentioned this to me, you'll meet producers that don't even know where their aluminium ends up. You'll meet producers, communities who don't even know what product is being mined in the place that they're mining, and they don't know where that goes. They don't know how they connect to the global economy. And I think that's important from an empowerment point of view, because they are a stakeholder and they should have understanding of what happens when it goes downstream.
But I think you bring out a super important point, which is it's not just about who and geographies of the location of this flow. It's really about the information that's associated with that and how that's used to inform decisions. And so you can spend, well, you can never get to the nth degree of tracing every atom. You are looking for sufficient information to inform decision making, to inform risk assessments, to inform action, you know, that kind of comes from those. And we know that chain of custody systems are diverse. ASI has one based around mass balance. It has a purpose, which has been to drive uptake of the performance standard. That's the attributes that we wanted to see in practice, and the confidence, therefore, that can flow around what practices have applied to the production, the transformation, the manufacturing use, and so on. And that circularity piece is really important for ASI, because obviously we take a whole of value chain approach, and looking at those responsibilities of producers in design decisions, in designing for those second lives beyond the recycling of material directly, thinking about that waste mitigation hierarchy. Obviously, we're heading into a standards revision next year. So all of these topics are really live for us, thinking about traceability expectations, how the chain of custody model might evolve to look at the claims effectively. What are people trying to say? What are they trying to know through this information that comes down, and what are they trying to say with regards to that? So there'll be some really first principles thinking within ASI as we head forward into that process. Mitigation. So action, the actions that we want to take with this information flow that happens, it's supposed to lower the risk salience for all stakeholders, not just corporate actors. You know, this double materiality lens that's coming through in EU and other legislation. Are we seeing risks actually getting lowered, risks getting mitigated? Is it happening or not? And if not, why not, do you think?
I mean, you and I, before we began today, we're just talking about the GAO report and how Dodd-Frank hasn't really led to the outcomes that it was supposed to, you know, the intent of the law. You know, that there are times when due diligence isn't delivering, but that's, I think, because of how it's being done and the resources that are being invested into it. And the fact is, good due diligence requires cooperation and collaboration, and not all companies have the resources or appetite to do that. We're especially seeing challenges in the automotive sector right now because of competition internationally that's creating real economic difficulty for Western automakers. And, you know, as a company, we advise automakers, and we advise coalitions of automakers that are trying to do due diligence. We do risk assessment for them and things like this, and help them with mitigation planning. We can see there's a little bit of a retreat from deep cooperation, collaboration, because they're really resource constrained and have to be extremely surgical about where they can presently put their resources, you know. Sorry, I may have taken myself slightly down a tangent there. But in terms of how we actually get to driving impact through due diligence, I think there's a few key ways to do that in terms of this art of how you do it, the intent of the way you do due diligence. And you know, the first is that, and there's a legacy, I think, from the first wave of companies that were involved with the OECD minerals guidance for 3TG, and the approach they take is, again, that paternalistic. We're looking after ourselves, and it's your job as a supplier to not screw up so that we don't have bad publicity. Thanks very much.
Exposure.
Yeah. And so hence this kind of really defensive compliance-led approach that doesn't really drive change. It just pushes liabilities upstream and pushes the costs of it upstream.
Right.
And there's been a lot of pushback from NGOs about how that's unequitable, which is a very fair point. But we're seeing, because of this push of double materiality, a kind of awakening where companies are like, oh, so it's not just about making sure that we don't have children in our mine. It's about making sure that through how we do the rest of our operations, we're not creating the conditions that make child labour more likely and more severe in the community. And I have a little metaphor for this, which is, the rugby players in the shower afterwards, and there's only one shower, and there's one rugby player, and he's totally fine because he's nice and clean because he's got the shower and he can come out looking all clean, but he's not doing anything to help his teammates get clean. And because I'm all right, Jack. And it's been a little bit like that. Whereas what we really need is, well, let's not get into talks of rugby players washing each other, but you know what I mean.
Move past there.
Yeah,
yes.
move past that visual imagery. I'm not sure I can move past that. But we need to be working together. And child labour is a really great example of this. When I was leading for the Global Battery Alliance, writing their Human Rights Index and their Child Labour Index with a working group of multiple stakeholders, we had a lot of debate about step 3 of the OECD RBC guidance, because how far should companies go to seek to eliminate child labour? That's the commitment of the GBA: eliminate child labour, support the elimination of child labour. And companies are like, well, we just want to address it. Because that was the level of ambition that existed in standards. We reviewed all the standards, and it was just at that level. In the minerals world, in the child labour world, and the child rights world, there was a lot more about actually addressing root causes. And we began to get a picture of what that would look like in practice for mining companies. And it's things that might not feel immediately obvious to you, but it's things like a lot of it's labour rights. You will reduce the risk of child labour in your communities if you make sure that you're offering things like flexible work, that you're dealing with gender discrimination and equity for women employees and the advancement of women. If you're supporting equal parental leave, not just maternity cover, but cover for your male workers. As well, all of these things, supporting not just occupational health and safety, which is vitally important, but community health. And then you start to move to more of the community-centered partnership stuff that comes through your community development programs. Are you, as part of your community development programs, considering child rights as an explicit category of affected stakeholders through which you could have a positive impact on? How are you doing that? Are you working with local advocates for child rights, but also local governments to see, what the related issues are? So you start to move from just minimum age statements and checking people's teeth to make sure they're 18 to actually this more integrated approach that will ultimately address the root causes. By the way, in the meantime, you're also dealing with other labour issues, or the point is these labour issues have co-benefits for child labour, but you actually you're using your power. You're using your power as a business to drive sustainable development. And actually, that's, for me, as a sustainable development practitioner, that's what business is for. Business is here not just to return profits to shareholders, but it's a corporate citizen. It's an actor in our society that has tremendous power to do good and to elevate everyone. And so to seek to maximize that in a way that, while you're controlling your risks, it is very logical to me. And I'm not saying do charity for charity's sake. I'm saying be strategic and clever about how you control your risks and the co-benefits you can get. But it's that shift from protecting yourself to how do we leverage our position, our role, to really address root causes? Because then you reduce the salience of the risk, not just for yourself, but for everyone, for all your stakeholders and the other businesses operating in the same territory and your business partners. And that's really where the level of ambition should be. I don't see us there yet, though. I really don't, and that's the issue.
Yeah. And I feel that there have been pockets of that ambition, I would say, at a system scale, at a sectoral scale, but it does feel like that's actually getting harder as kind of compliance frameworks become more onerous, from a regulatory and from another space. And so, we've had discussions within ASI where people try to differentiate the kind of the burden side with trying to make room for that investment in impact, really. And I think that's a balance that we've got to try and juggle. And as we look ahead to the next revision of the standards, how you still make space for that, because there can be a lot of expectation to see all of the, the procedures and the minimum age and the, how do you document and evidence the kind of systems level management system stuff, but how can we also make sure that there's room left and capacity and bandwidth for sustainability teams to be doing this kind of deeper, broader work, really?
Well, this is where tracking effectiveness is really, really valuable and important, because, the fourth step, which is called audit in the OECD minerals guidance, is actually about tracking effectiveness of your systems. And what we find is, for many companies that are quite immature, it's all about just getting to the audit and passing the audit and pass the audit, right? And then we've got to do a couple of things to say, oh, fine, and then that's it, job done. But actually, the audit, like traceability, is a hygiene factor. It's a means to an end. So actually, the purpose of the audit is for you to assess the effectiveness of your management systems for controlling ESG risks for you and your affected rights holders, and which includes nature as well. And that's really what it's for. And we call that kind of a post-audit mentality. It's not that you abandon audits, it's that you really get what they are for. And if you do that, if you prioritize the tracking effectiveness piece of your system and you make sure you're doing that well, then, and the effectiveness around the intent of due diligence, being that partner in communities that drive sustainable development through your presence, whilst building value for your shareholders, right? Which is more of a better business fiduciary mentality than a classic corporate governance shareholder primacy mentality. But there's scope for that, and there are people that are moving towards that thinking in our sectors. If you can do that, then you will actually begin to elevate the things that really will make a difference. But I completely agree with you. I've seen evidence of when the compliance burden becomes too great, companies just throw all their resources into complying. And I've said on stage before, never let the lawyers lead the due diligence process. Sorry, lawyers, I love you. You're very important, and I love working with you, and I learn so much with you, and we do a lot together. But I think they are a key member of the team, and they need to be involved in the decisions. But again, coming back to the art of due diligence, there's a piece of compliance, there's a piece of marketing, there's a piece of procurement, all very necessary commercial functions that must be involved in decision making. But actually, to realize that function of business as an actor of change, we need it to be led by people that think about due diligence holistically and in terms of what it's really for. So as you come to your standard revision, I'm really excited to see how you're going to make that space and make that achievement, because I know companies are struggling with it.
Yes, well, watch this space. So let's turn to another challenging topic, which is access to remedy. One of the key elements of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Tell us, Estelle, what is remedy? Why is it important? Why is it hard? How good are mineral chain actors at achieving remedy?
Yeah, thanks for this. So I'm going to read out the definition of remedy from the United Nations Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, because I think it's important to be very clear. So remedy may include apologies, restitution, rehabilitation, financial or non-financial compensation, and punitive sanctions, whether criminal or administrative, like fines, as well as the prevention of harm through things like injunctions or guarantees of non-repetition. So mitigation is an important part of remedy, but it doesn't constitute remedy. Now, that's an important definition for everybody to learn about, because the reason remedy crossed my desk was when we began looking at the RBC guidance and the UNGPs and said, we better get everybody caught up with this. We noticed that the OECD minerals guidance doesn't talk about remedy. It does have under step 1 an operational grievance mechanism, but it says that it's for early warning, not that it's necessarily for actually addressing harms caused. So companies that are wedded to the OECD minerals guidance right now are ignoring this crucial part to not just conformance with these international frameworks, but also building trusting relationships with their stakeholders. And I'll give you some examples of why remedy really matters. First, in Chile, 80% of new mining applications are held up because of community resistance as a result of community perceptions of probable harm and lack of trust that the companies will and the government will run things in a way that will generate benefits for local communities. And that's born on the back of experience, of legacies of harm, right? And which haven't been remedied, haven't been addressed. And so we can't expedite expansion of supply of mined materials from highly impacted jurisdictions if we don't get better at remedy. That's the first. The second is when we were drafting the OECD handbook for environmental due diligence, we were working with a working group of about 30 organizations, all different types of stakeholders. And we came to this section on remedy and we said, let's go out there and see if there's some case studies of good remedy for environmental damage in mining and minerals. And what we learned from speaking to industry associations, companies, and doing an internet search was if there was environmental remedy happening, it wasn't being written about very much. And when it was happening, it was usually being done through compensation such as fines, rather than necessarily, deep, diverse forms of remedy that actually restore the environment fully, which of course is expensive and complicated to do, so best avoid these things. And which addresses the impacts on human rights as well that are associated with environmental harm. So there was this huge information gap. And so my former colleagues, but who I still collaborate with, Dr. Fabiana Di Lorenzo and Dr. Victoria Gromwald, I'm not a doctor, but it's wonderful to be in their company. We decided that we would write a book on the role of remedy in the just energy transition and look at examples of where businesses in minerals value chains have got it right and what all the different mechanisms are. And so that book will be coming out next year. We've got about over half the chapters are now nearly ready. Others are coming. I know that you are contributing one to talk about, your Indigenous people's platform. So I do want us to talk a bit about that in a second and the role it will play, Fiona. And the idea is to try to kind of ask that question, is why is remedy important and how do we get better at it? And the good news is that since we began thinking about that book and writing it, we're beginning to see organizations like standard setters going, oh my gosh, we better get our heads around this. And that's really welcome. There's one more reason why you should do remedy, because if you don't, you'll get sued, especially if you're UK registered or potentially Canadian with the Canadian Ombudsman, because the law firm Lead A makes a point of going after companies that where there are claims from affected rights holders that their human rights have been violated, and they have successfully achieved a range of out-of-court settlements with mining companies operating in Zambia, Mozambique, Tanzania, elsewhere as well for those violations. So if you are a UK entity, you have an extra reason to seek to take remedy seriously, because there's a very real judicial and thus reputational financial impact if you don't take care of your stakeholders that have been affected adversely by your actions.
And there can be a lot of barriers for rights holders, can't there, in accessing grievance mechanisms and the way that they function. Deanna Kemp at the University of Queensland has done some really interesting work looking at pathologies that structurally there can be all of these dysfunctional ways in which these mechanisms work, and we've certainly shared that in an article, with some of our members to be aware, of what some of those are. Have you seen examples of, well, actually, we're kind of running out of time, but have you got a particular example of where you were looking for positive ones? What were the kind of success factors that people can take away?
Right. So, I mean, the United Nations Guiding Principles offers, a set of, I can't remember the language right now, conditions for a successful remedy mechanism. And really, standard setters should be seeking to align companies' grievance mechanisms with those. And so it's things like transparency, inclusion, democracy, and so on. And there's one particular case in Tanzania I can think of where they've gone to great lengths to produce, an effective grievance mechanisms for the harms that have been caused within the scope of the lawsuit. But from what I can see, they're not necessarily putting in place an effective grievance mechanism for future harms that may arise. They're just dealing with the historic. So you're that kind of defeats the point. And it's really important to be prepared. So, you need to have a grievance mechanism that people know about. But actually, I think one of the things that companies could do is educate their rights holders on what their pathways to justice are. So this is something that's come up very clearly in the book, is that affected rights holders don't even know that they have the right of recourse. They're often in jurisdictions where the law is not well enforced, or it's very corrupted, or they simply can't afford to go to court. So judicial mechanisms within their own jurisdictions aren't available to them. They're not aware that that company is a member of a standard setting initiative like the Solar Stewardship Initiative or IRMA that also have grievance mechanisms, or RMI. I don't know if you do, Fiona.
Of course.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
So rights holders affected by your members can therefore also seek recourse through the standard setters. So there's actually multiple pathways through which, in theory, they could access remedy. I mean, let's not forget, for many of the African countries in which I work, there are many locally structured conflict management mechanisms led by tribal and customary authorities as well. So there's a lot available in theory, but do they know what's available? And I think that would actually be a huge benefit to educate stakeholders of any business along a mineral value chain, not just, oh, we have a complaints mechanism and you send us an email or pick up the phone, but that if you are affected by our options, in the first instance, please do come to us, but here's the range of actors that you could go to for advice. And that would do so much, I think, to support access to remedy that is efficient and more effective for everyone. So,
and I think it is a complicated space, isn't it? There's judicial and non-judicial kind of avenues for rights holders to explore how they can raise grievances, identify, serious impacts, and look for remedy within that. Certainly for ASI, within our standard, we require operational level grievance mechanisms to be in place. We have the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and that whole structure in terms of respecting human rights and access to remedy within that. And we have our own grievance mechanism as complaints mechanisms ourselves. And what we have found, we've published 3 cases so far, and we're working through another one at the moment. And really the relationships and the dialogue-based approach has been really key, particularly where that involves communities, because to build a level of trust, to feel comfortable to raise it, very quasi-judicial kind of processes, very adjudicative processes are not necessarily comfortable. And it's really trying to kind of get the parties to hear each other, and then to start to kind of create the ability to have the conversation about how to resolve those going forward. And some of those issues can be very complex and historical and legacy-based issues, yes.
I think that's such an important point, because people think of grievance management as being like this big whole process and it's costly and it's difficult.
Judge. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. But actually, when we're writing management systems for mining companies on how do they deal with artisan small-scale mining, of course, grievance mechanisms come into, that how we build their own internal system for managing that. And the most important, avenues for managing grievances with artisan small-scale mining is their exploration teams and their community engagement teams, because on a day-to-day basis, they're interacting with, either in the same landscapes or with the ASM or with the communities impacted by ASM or of whom the ASM are members. And as grievances get raised, they can often deal with them on the spot, but they need to understand remedy as a practice, and they need to understand the escalation. When is it right to escalate it? And it needs to be recorded. The grievance, even if it's just verbally communicated, needs to be recorded. And this is what happened, and this is what I said and did. That's the kind of day-to-day practice of it. But those kind of day-to-day small managements of grievances, as far as you can, they not only may perhaps postpone things from getting worse, but they minimize the risk of it getting worse, and they give you valuable intelligence as a company as to what's bubbling up, and therefore help you put in place avoidance strategies, management strategies, call that community meeting to discuss something, go and speak with the chiefs. And there's one thing that I really want to add on remedy, which is women and women's rights. And women are disproportionately harmed in mineral value chains. and women struggle to often access remedy more than men do. One of the lessons from the Tanzania case study in the book is, although the company has built, what is, in theory, from a governance point of view, a robust system, women victims have struggled with the process because some of the claims are around gender-based violence. There's needed to be witnesses, they've needed to have there's been character requirements for character defense from community leaders who are often men, and so on. And so there's a real barrier and stigma for women to step forward and claim their rights.
Yes.
And those gender considerations need to be really deeply and adequately considered. And the other thing we learned from the Centre for Child Rights in Business when planning this for the Child Labour Index, the GBA, was one of the mistakes companies make with remedy is they just go and try and sort it themselves. Whereas sometimes you need to appoint an independent third party like an NGO to help manage the restoration. For example, if there's a child that's been affected through child labour and you're somehow connected to it, you shouldn't be the one necessarily managing or handling that. You should be appointing an independent expert organization to support that child to its point of restoration, because otherwise it can generate a conflict of interest. So remedy is a real profession and skill, and unfortunately we do a long way to go as a sector in getting better at it. But I'm so pleased the conversation's opened up. We've got a panel on it at the Indaba, for example. We had a panel on it at last year's Natural Resources Forum. So let's keep the conversation going, and maybe we find that the aluminium sector can really take the lead on showing the world how to do it. That's my challenge to you, Fiona.
Yes, well, we take that challenge. And our conversation could continue. We have so much to talk about, but we are pretty much at time. Is there anything that you would like to conclude with? A nice pithy piece of advice or a call to action? ASI, yes, we take that challenge on, but for those listening.
Well, I think be proportionate, be risk-based, allocate your resources sensibly. Remember what this is ultimately about. It's ultimately about driving impact for everyone. And of course, you have a fiduciary duty as directors to protect the interests of the shareholders and the corporation in the first instance. But actually, when you do due diligence properly and you reduce risk for everyone, you're doing that. So I think that's one key message. But I think the other key message is you can't do this alone. You can't do due diligence alone. And whether that's, and not just by fundamentally you're within a business partnership, but regardless of the business partnership, you need collaborations with others on the ground, in your community, in your sector, through standard setters like ASI, to really take action. And with that, I want to just pitch the cooperation pathway for sustainable minerals value chains that you very kindly reviewed for me, Fiona, and improved. That Levin Sources has just published as a tool to allow companies, any actor really that is needing to collaborate to do due diligence better, to really figure out what do they need to do next to make those cooperations effective, because actually that's where we often fail, because cooperation and partnering is hard.
Yes.
Yeah. So
yeah. Well, it's been wonderful, Estelle. I really liked that summing up and all of the thoughts that we've shared, both in this session and outside of it. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us and hope that we can all move on from this with a little bit of hopefully positive energy around creating positive impact together, how we can all work towards a more sustainable world, even when it's feeling like it's harder every day sometimes. I think for those of us who've been in this space or new to this space, I think that's what still continues to drive us forward, and we have to keep finding that energy together. Thanks, Estelle. Thanks, everybody. And we look forward to seeing you in our next webinar, TBC. Thanks.
bye. Thanks, Fiona.
Bye.